Hello, I'm Will Henry,
And I'm Andrew Dow.
and our 20% project is building a computer.
So why we decided on this project? Both of us and our peers have a connection to computers. Today's kids grow up relying on technology in their social, academic, and personal lives. However, many still don't understand how they work. So if our computers broke, what would we do without them? Almost nothing.
We thought it was important to learn about the different parts of a computer so that we could further our understanding and further understand the many interesting aspects of a computer, and if there was ever a problem, be able to fix it. As technology becomes a bigger part of our lives, we thought you should know what we found out, so that maybe you can fix your own computers, build a cheap one, or at least learn some interesting facts about the fundamentals of computers in the next 10 to 15 minutes. To make for easier understanding, and since this is biology class, we have made analogies for each computer part, relating them to the human body parts.
A computer's main function is to store, retrieve, and process data. In a computer, an input requests an output. For example, if you wanted to type the word dog into Google Docs, the typing of the letters is your process for the request, or the input. The computer would take the letters from the stored data and complete the output, which is typing out the word dog into the doc. This sequence is used for almost anything in a computer. Turning it on or off, opening a program, or even listening to music.
There are many different parts required to make a computer. Some of these include the motherboard, the processor, the memory RAM/RAM, the hard drive, the CPU, the power supply, and the fans. These parts are usually referred to as the core components of a computer. To upgrade your computer, you will probably be upgrading these parts. For example, an i5 core is worse than an i7 core, so you can upgrade it to an i7 core.
The form factor of a computer is its sizing capability. Some parts don't have a universal size, such as the casing and the motherboard, so they come with a form factor. All parts need to have the same form factor in order for the computer to function properly. This is like people needing different size clothes to fit them properly. The most common form factor for a computer is the ATX form factor.
So, the parts we decided to use.
The Intel Pentium G5400 processor. The CPU, or Central Processing Unit, is an important part of every computer. It sends signals via the motherboard to every other part of the computer, and it works off of instructions to keep the computer working in order. This one is inexpensive, but it functions well.
The processor functions as the heart of the computer. Our heart's function is to pump blood throughout the body, supplying oxygen and vital nutrients to the other body parts so that they can function properly. The CPU is similar in function, as it sends signals to the other parts, and so that they too can function properly. The motherboard itself is a printed circuit board that allows the CPU, RAM, and all of the other computer hardware parts to communicate with each other. There are huge variations in motherboards, from design, cases, power supply size, form factor, and compatibility. Our motherboard is an inexpensive option that is compatible with all of the other parts.
A motherboard is like the nervous system of a computer. In the human body, a nervous system is a network of cells and nerves that collect sensory data from sensory organs, such as the brain, the spinal cord, and sensory neurons, and communicates that info with the rest of the body. A motherboard is also a network, if you will, of small circuits that take input from the CPU and communicate that with the rest of the computer. A Ballistic Sport LTDDR4 4 GB RAM. The RAM, or random access memory, is the short-term memory of a data and is the temporarily stored data. The more RAM in a computer, the more communication it can do at the same time, which means better performance for the computer. Our 4 GB stick is enough to do the job for the computer and is inexpensive.
The RAM is essentially the short-term memory of a computer. It allows for quick and easy access to the data, and it has limited capacity. A hard drive disk, sometimes abbreviated as a hard drive or HDD, is a memory hardware device that permanently stores and retrieves data on a computer. All computers have a hard drive installed in them, which is used to store files, the operating system, software programs, and a user's personal files. Our hard drive is 1 terabyte of memory, which is more than enough.
A hard drive in a computer is like the long-term memory of a computer. A hard drive stores large amounts of data that is like the memory that you made a long time ago. It is a bit harder to access than the short-term memory or the RAM of a computer.
Power supply, digestive system.
The EVGA 500W1 power supply. A power supply supplies power to the whole computer. A power supply converts energy from the outlet, which is the AC current, into usable energy for the computer, which is the DC current. Most PCs today can be plugged into an outlet and use this.
We think of the power supply through the digestive system. Much like the power supply converts AC current into DC current, the digestive system is responsible for converting food into energy and nutrients for the rest of the body. The computer case is used to hold all of the internal components of a computer in place so that they are protected and held in optimal position for functioning. It also protects against dust and other destructive objects from outside of the case. In many cases, it makes the computer look more appealing too.
The casing is like the skeleton of a computer. It provides structural support as well as holds all the parts in place. And it provides all the parts with protection from outside things such as dust. The Silverstone CP-F01 fan splitter. A fan splitter in a computer is used to plug multiple fans into the motherboard. Since our case came with 2 fans, we needed a fan splitter in order to function both of them.
The fan splitter, along with other wires and cables, act as the arteries and veins of a computer. The wires and cables send electrical currents to the rest of the computer so that it can function. The arteries and veins send and receive blood to and from the heart so the rest of the body can function.
Ubuntu OS. An OS or operating system is a large program that controls and manages the software and hardware of a computer. Ubuntu is a free operating system from Linux and can run many programs and features.
The operating system is similar to the DNA of a human, as it is a program that runs the whole machine. The DNA of a human is essentially a code that acts as instructions for many of the functions and characteristics of humans and other living organisms. Computer assembly. When we started to build the computer, everything went well. We unboxed our motherboard and successfully inserted the CPU into the chip socket. We then applied the fan that kept it cool correctly. The next step was to insert the motherboard into the case. That's where we started to have some problems.
When we tried to put the motherboard into the case, we realized it was too small. Looking back, we realized that the case itself was an ATX mini tower when it should have been an ATX mid tower, which is what all the other parts were compatible with.
We solved this problem by purchasing a new case that was compatible with all of the other parts. This set us back around 3 days because we had to wait for the case to arrive. The case we purchased wasn't mid-tower ATX case, so it was compatible with all the other parts. Us building a computer part 2. Once we had the correct case, we started to assemble the computer again. We had already assembled the motherboard, and now that we had the correct case, we put the motherboard into the computer.
Once the motherboard was in the case, we placed the RAM, hard drive, and SATA cables into the motherboard. Then we place the power supply along with the power cables into the motherboard.
We had assembled everything correctly, but when we tried to power it on, we had more problems. The motherboard we had purchased did not support the CPU that we had. We had purchased a motherboard that was too old. It only supported 6th and 7th gen type generation CPUs, and we had an 8th gen. This resulted in the short beef that we heard when we tried to first start the computer, because the computer could not pass the test that the motherboard was running.
With the new motherboard, we had to take the whole thing apart and rebuild it with the new motherboard. After this, we turned the computer on, and thankfully it worked.
We then plugged the computer into an old monitor and booted it up. We installed the Ubuntu operating system using a USB stick, and we were good to go.
Due to the mistakes when buying the parts, we had to do multiple trials of building the computer. In all, we had to try to build the computer 3 times. Had we avoided these mistakes, we could have built it in 1 try.
Overall, we are very glad that we did this project. We both learned so much about how a computer works and functions, and we learned that almost everything in the world can be related back to biology. Thank you. And this is the computer. Thank you. We gotta move this.
All right.
Oh. Any questions?
Did you guys just build a Mac or the PC?
We built everything inside the box, basically.
Okay.
So all the parts that you can see were what's called not us. We gathered all of these individual parts,
Yep.
and then we put them all together to make the box with everything inside the box, which powers this.
Would it have helped if you asked somebody before you did it what you should do so you wouldn't have to change the box?
Well, we did watch a video about how to put them together, and we did do all the research we could about which parts fit with each other. It's just human error. Sometimes we don't read over something, and then we buy the wrong part.
I think being a doctor myself, when I was studying all the human anatomy, and it reminds me of all those days when I studied human anatomy and how you guys incorporated all the biology, human anatomy in the computer part.
Yeah.
I think that was very, very cool idea, and it is very, very made easy for understanding for others who don't know much about the computer. It's very well done, guys. Really good job.
You have a plan with this computer data? Do you guys have a fiddle plan for the computer?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna keep it because according to him, he says I can. So.
My first computer, which of course seems like the Stone Ages now, did not have a hard drive. Everything came on disks that you put in. Could you think of an analogy to that biologically, like maybe a way we've evolved to do more differently or something like that? Did you even know there used to be computers without a hard drive?
They came with floppy disks. But I didn't research that. That's just my knowledge.
Trying to think of the analogy for evolution, basically. It's almost like throwing out the old parts and upgrading to new ones, almost.
It almost might be the difference between the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. I don't know if it's that big a difference. But it was just interesting to think about in your context. Thank you.
How much memory can that computer?
So we have 1 terabyte of a hard drive, which your phone only has around 64 megabytes, and we have like 900 more megabytes than that.
Oh.
So what's called, and then we also have 4 gigabytes of RAM, which is like short-term memory. So like if I have Google Chrome running in the background, and I want to launch and I want to like click onto it, that's what the RAM does, and you don't need as much, nearly as much, on the RAM as you do for the what's it called, for the hard drive.
So do you have any analogy about the body aging? What's the part of the computer related to the body aging part?
I guess it's just the computer getting old, maybe like all the parts getting worn out. Eventually a computer will cease to work. I guess that's the only analogy I can make at the moment to aging of the human.
Mostly like how most people sometimes like their knees will go, and that's from like too much use almost over the years. And so like if there's too much use of the computer over the years, eventually it will slow down too.
You mentioned that it was less expensive to put it together yourselves. Does it save a significant amount?
For what we wanted to build, it did save a significant amount, and it also was the experience of putting the computer together.
And do you think that, like, I know you are experts on it now, but could anybody do it? Like, if you watch the video and.
Anyway, we literally learned it in like a week or so, like how to build it. The building process took a little bit longer, but after you learn it, you get the hang of it.
So you do it again?
Yeah, if we needed to.
One question I heard from my husband online: how to relate the CS to biology with the computer CS or computer science? How do you relate these two subjects?
Well, what's it called? With computer science, it's a lot of coding, basically like that. And I guess coding can be related to DNA, because DNA is like the code of humans, basically. And so computer science, it's like the code of the programs. So like the code is basically the program's DNA. And so what's it called? When you turn this on, that's a specific code to how to turn the computer on. So kind of like the DNA of the computer, the DNA of us, that is a whole connection that we can make.
It's like this tool is starting emerging, right? You fix the code bug, so now the gene therapy, right? So you fix the gene with problem, it's like you're fixing the program stuff.
I know you guys are like kind of like on the budget, but how well do you think this computer would like hold up to maybe like more stronger, like maybe video games, for example? Like, would it put up well?
I don't think it can work with like strong video games. Maybe the one we had on this computer before was Solitaire. I'm thinking that's pretty close to what the limit of this computer is.
We can easily like watch YouTube videos on this computer, but like if you try to do like a very big game, it probably doesn't meet the minimum requirements of most of these games. In at least one aspect of it or another. Thank you. Down.
Give a mic check.
I like clip it?
I guess so.
Alright. Huh? No, I don't think I broke it. I'm just gonna hold it. Okay. Oh, sh- Okay, hi everyone. I'm Maddie, and my passion is learning about invasive species. So I first learned about invasive species when I visited the Cape Eleuthera Institute in Eleuthera, Bahamas with my 6th grade class. And when we were there, we learned about how invasive species were affecting the Atlantic. And their biggest threat right now is the lionfish. So when we were there, we focused on studying the lionfish, which included dissecting them and looking at their eating habits and just how they're affecting the Atlantic. Invasive species are exotic species that are deliberately or accidentally introduced to a new environment where it thrives, and it usually causes the downfall of other species which can change the natural ecosystem. And some causes of unintentional spread are small organisms or seeds can attach to your clothes, your shoes, or your luggage, and they can spread to new environments. Fortunately, when new species are introduced to new environments, they won't thrive right away because it isn't their natural habitat, but they could end up becoming invasive, and they're found all over the world and are really difficult to manage. So this relates to what we learned in class about population, interactions, and systems, because we learned when there's populations in the same environment at the same time, they compete for different resources and food and space, and invasives are a variable that can impact the system of predator versus prey that controls the resources in the organisms in the environment, because the invasives outcompete all sorts of the native species and they don't have any natural predators, so it just results in them being on top. So for my project, I researched 2 species in depth, which included just studying their solutions and the effectiveness of them. My first species was lionfish. Lionfish are a type of fish with dangerous venomous spines that can cause severe pain, blistering, and paralysis. And right now they are native to the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, but they spread to the Atlantic, all the way up to Florida and down to the Bahamas. And so their diet is very wide, and so their stomachs probably start up to here, but they can grow up to 30 times the average size. And each season they can produce up to 2 million eggs, and they can spawn multiple times in a season. So they out-eat native fish such as snapper and grouper, and they also have an effect on the coral because they eat the herbivore fish that protect the coral. And since they have been introduced to the Atlantic, they have reduced the biodiversity. So the first theory on why they spread is that they were in fish tanks and aquariums, and then once they couldn't be taken care of anymore, they just released them into the water. And the second theory is that Hurricane Andrew cracked a tank that was close to the water, and then they were released. And then the third theory was that they were on boats from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and they were released off of the boats. Currently, there are many solutions. One is that marine biologists and researchers are trying to learn more about the species by dissecting them and just trying to see their eating habits. And scuba divers have been placing these sighting markers that are cork with bright colored tape wherever they see a lionfish, and that can help hunters or rangers remove them from that area. There are also hunting competitions. There was one in Key Largo, Florida, and they ended up eradicating 707 lionfish, but that only works locally and it doesn't work on a greater scale. There's one of the biggest solutions is that people are eating them instead of other fish for dinner. And so I've heard that it's surprisingly tasty and it can taste similar to halibut, and it's actually safe once the spines are removed. And so there are actually some health benefits to eating the lionfish. They're higher in omega-3 fatty acids and lower in omega-6 fatty acids, which can raise your good cholesterol and lower your bad cholesterol. And there's 18 grams of protein per each fillet for only 80 calories. Whole Foods is currently selling them at their 26 Florida locations, and they're trying to expand selling them at all different Whole Foods. So once it comes to a Whole Foods near me, I would gladly try it. So the solutions reduces numbers, but only on a local scale, and the number of lionfish are still increasing. And also because of climate change, the ocean temperatures are rising, so they could even be coming up north to us. For my second species, I researched the small Indian mongoose. They were deliberately introduced to 45 different islands in 1883 to control the rat problems, and they are listed as one of the most threatening invasive species in the world. They're carnivores that eat small vertebrates, but their specific diet is unknown because once they go to new areas, they just eat whatever they see, and that's why they're so scary. It's because they keep adapting and changing to new environments. So currently in Jamaica, they have caused 2 species of birds to go extinct. One is the barred wing rail, which people described popular in 1875, and then once they were exposed in 1883, this bird became extinct. And a similar thing happened to the Jamaican petrel, and also birds in Hawaii and Fiji have gone extinct. This also causes sea turtles. This is also causing a problem on sea turtles because they eat the endangered sea turtle eggs. There's only one solution currently being used, and that includes trapping them in just certain areas where there are a lot of them, or there are small birds that could currently be at risk. But these traps lead a wide area where there's no competition for resources, and so even more mongooses go to that area because suddenly there's an abundance of food. And so this is hopeless. My solution that I thought would work would be more to protect the species that are already there instead of trying to get rid of this one, and to just try to prevent them from spreading anywhere by keeping them in one area instead of getting rid of them in the area where they're most abundant. So my conclusion after looking at these two was that you can't really come up with one solution to eradicate all of the invasive species because each species is going to have their own solution. But after looking at all of these, I found that everybody needs to help, because if only a certain amount of people help, only a certain amount of the invasive species are going to die out. And so what I've learned is that you have to prevent invasive species from spreading, you have to report when you see one, and you have to aware others of when you see an invasive species. So these are some local species in Massachusetts that you might see around. This is the Japanese honeysuckle, this is the black locust, and that is a leek moth. So what I have done is I have downloaded an app that's called Outsmart Invasives, and this records the species that you see in a database. And this can just help scientists know where the species are, and so it can help get them out of that area or know where they are. My next steps would be to look at plant invasives and see how they're being affected. And I wanted to know how we could help solve this issue at school. So I was thinking like I could try to get more people to use the app and just let more people know about this. And I was thinking like maybe I could look around campus to see if I see any invasive species, because one of the big ones is mint. So I was just wondering if like anyone planted a little garden and they planted mint and it could spread to any other places. So I did have some challenges when doing this project. It was definitely time management was a big one, and procrastination. And I also had some trouble to figure out how I could help stop invasive species. So I chose to do this project is because I wanted to teach people who may not have known much about them that we can help stop them. And I chose lionfish and mongoose because all of the theories on why they spread, they started off with on that we spread them, because all the theories for the lionfish were based on mistakes made by humans, and the mongooses were deliberately spread by us. So that's why I just wanted to let everyone know that if we help prevent them, we could possibly be helping an ecosystem. And I also just wanted to let everyone know that we are all of a part of our environment, and we all are responsible for its protection. Does anyone have any questions?
So are they spreading or are they depleting?
No, they're spreading.
Still spreading?
And like even more new ones are being made, and it's just too fast to even create a project on every day. Krish?
You mentioned the app. Have you ever considered like maybe making your own app, maybe uploading your app?
Yeah, I kind of considered it a little bit. I mean, this one works really well, but this app is only in Massachusetts. So I was trying to find other ones that maybe were like more locally, like not local, like more like when you travel or something like that and you see something.
Can you use the different invasives to try to stop each other?
So yeah, that's what kind of happened with the mongooses, how they released them to try to stop the rats, but then they became invasive and started killing other species. So I think it's best just not to spread species in general, because you don't really know what's going to happen, because they've never really been in that environment before. Dr. Crothers.
You may have addressed this, but how do you think climate change has factored into this?
Well, so as you know, like the ocean temperatures are rising, so it's easier for the lionfish to live where they are right now, because it's a good climate for them, and as the temperatures are rising near us, they could be migrating north and spreading even more. And scientists may not be aware that they're spreading north, so they just could be living in peace up north with no predators. Thank you. Is there a way to like project this without showing that? Is this right? Okay. Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Danielle Swartz, and I've been a student at Worcester Academy for 4 years, and I'm currently enrolled in honors biology. And I did my 20% project on the art of baking. And before I start, I'd like to pass out some of the things that I've made, and you guys can taste test them. So there'll be some at each table that you guys can try. I'd just like to warn though, if you do have any allergies, like a nut allergy or an egg allergy, I'd recommend not trying anything just because we were working. Yeah. And I also have plates. Okay. Okay, so there will be plates being passed around and forks, or just go ahead for it. That's fine also. So as you can obviously tell, my project is on baking. So I'll just let the stuff get passed around. All right, so while you all are enjoying the food, I'd like to explain a little bit about my process and how I decided to do this project. So first of all, what is the 20% project? Most of you already know, but it's a project about our passions, and it revolves around a topic
that we've either always wanted to do or expand upon a topic that we already know a lot about. And I chose to do baking for my presentation. I chose this because not only do I love eating, and I really love food, but I've always loved experimenting with desserts and flavors and presentation. Ever since I was young, I loved creating either chocolate soup or little cakes just to present to my parents and create my own little restaurant. It was just a really fun and comforting experience. I also have a lot of memories associated with homemade desserts for birthday parties and celebrations. And for this project, I wanted to combine this nostalgia as well as the modern creativity and innovation that is involved with baking. I was also inspired by traveling and how desserts really have a big role in culture. For example, over March break, I took a trip to Rome with the Latin program, and I tried some tiramisu, gelato, macarons. There's some chocolate heels right up there. And I wanted to investigate more about how baking is an integral part of community. I was also inspired by baking shows and by Instagram and by these artists who are testing the limits of confectionery art. And here's just some examples of some things that I thought were really creative, really innovative, and they really inspired me to learn more about baking as an art form. Now, of course, my goal was not to create those amazing magical things, and in the beginning, I might have bit off a little bit more than I could chew. I was imagining wedding cakes and delicate chocolate work, and that is definitely not what ended up happening. So I decided to tweak my goals a little bit. I decided I wanted to create a really solid foundation that would help me later on to experiment more. Some skills I wanted to learn were how to layer cake, how to make pies, how to make pastry. I also really love art and drawing and painting, so I wanted a way to incorporate my love for art in a way that could be aesthetically pleasing with the way I present my desserts. So I've split my process of baking all of these things into 3 phases, and I've sorted them based on difficulty, complexity, and each phase has its own featured dessert. So this is the process. Phase 1, I wanted to start with some of the easier stuff. I had made most of this stuff before, but I wanted to get back into the rhythm of baking and get my feet wet a little bit. I took mostly recipes from the internet, and I just attempted to make things that I thought would look great. So this was my first featured dessert, and it was a chocolate cake with marshmallow frosting. And while the picture does look pretty nice, and while it did taste really amazing, I wasn't really satisfied completely. For example, the layers were very uneven, and as you can't even tell there's a second layer. And I wasn't really sure how to frost it really smoothly and nicely. Oh, I don't know. Okay. Some other things I made a part of phase 1 were these classic vanilla cupcakes and iced sugar cookies. These were also very, very simple, but once again, I just wanted to start getting my feet wet. I did face a bit of a challenge with the iced cookies, however, because I'm not a pro at icing things, and I kind of led into a little bit of a catastrophe. Instead of using a pastry bag, I just had a Ziploc bag, and I cut the tip off, and icing was everywhere, and I definitely had to learn from this experience. So this is when we get into phase 2, which is where I decided I wasn't really satisfied with where I was going with this project. I felt like I didn't have the skills to kind of make what I had envisioned. So I decided to ask for some help. And so I have a family friend, and his name is Alexander, and he owns a bakery called the La Patisserie here in Worcester. And I don't know why it keeps switching, but he also does a lot of catering and stuff around Worcester, and I asked him for some professional advice to help me on this journey. So I not only learned a lot more professional skills, I learned about baking not only as a hobby, but as a profession. So this is the featured dessert. I'm going to put that there, of phase 2. And it was a triple layered pineapple cake with blueberry filling and chocolate frosting. And each of you have a little sample of that actually at your tables. And this turned out a lot better than the cake I made originally. I definitely learned from many of my mistakes. For example, I decided to actually measure and divide the batter equally. So as you can see, it has a really nice and solid structure. The homemade frosting was a lot smoother. I learned how to spread it out with a spatula and wait till the cake is cooled, which is very important. I also, with this cake, also experimented with some flavors. Instead of just a simple vanilla cake, I experimented with pineapple and blueberry to add a more complex flavor profile. With this, it was also my first time experimenting with the composition and the presentation. So for example, I tried to have some contrasting colors of the blueberries and raspberries and create them in an aesthetically pleasing way. Okay, so some other desserts from phase 2 include these 3 desserts, which are some chocolate chip scones, a peach pie, and cannelés. So with the scones, they were also pretty simple and really delicious, but I did learn a couple new skills through them. For example, I learned to cut butter, which means when you have really, really rock-hard butter and you incorporate it into the flour to create an almost wet sand-like texture. And the challenge with the scones is that they can easily become rock hard and not edible. But as I learned more about techniques, I made them perfect. The next dessert was the peach pie. And this also taught me a lot about the crust specifically. For example, the crust was, you also had to cut the butter in, which rock hard butter, it became very crumbly and cracked, and it was really difficult to get it into the actual pan. And I also, for the peaches, had to learn how to saute them. And I actually used a special technique to get a very rich flavor. And we added alcohol into the peaches and then set them on fire with a blowtorch. And this was a very exciting experience, but it turned out to have some really amazing peaches on the inside. Also with the peach pie, I experimented with some decorations on top. And I used some of the leftover crust to make some leaves and patterns to just make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Lastly, for the cannelés, cannelés is a French custard cake, and it's moist, really moist on the inside, and almost has a crust on the outside, but it is made out of one batter. So in order to get these 2 different textures, you have to make sure to coat the mold that you pour them in heavily in butter. And these cannelés are very difficult to make because they can easily deflate or overbake, which is why they're a little bit high maintenance and you have to make sure to watch them really carefully. So for the last phase, phase 3, I started to gain the confidence to try some of the most difficult recipes of the baking world. And I also got more experience and more exposure to different types of doughs and techniques. So for one of the featured desserts that you all have at your tables are these chocolate eclairs with chocolate custard inside. And with these chocolate eclairs, I learned how to make choux pastry. Choux pastry makes up cream puffs. It's airy and light and a little bit fluffy, a little bit flaky as well as fluffy. And that wasn't too difficult, but the part that was really difficult was the custard that went inside. So it's a pretty basic chocolate custard, and you have to inject it into each side of the eclair with a piping bag and a really thin tip. But the filling was way too thick in the beginning, and as I was trying to squeeze it in, the pastry bag exploded, and there was chocolate on the floor, and the dogs were licking it up, and there was chocolate on my hands, and it was a bit of a catastrophe. So I evolved and tweaked the recipe a little bit and thinned out the filling with some milk, and it went in nice and smoothly. Also, the icing on top was just a basic chocolate icing, but it was definitely improvement from the icing on my sugar cookies from phase 1, and I definitely learned how to make it nice and glossy and form into a hard crust. The next featured dessert of phase 3 are these chocolate hazelnut macarons. And these, I'd say, were the hardest desserts that I made. And these are really difficult to make because they can easily crack and break apart, and they are very, very delicate. And you make these with, first you make a fluffy meringue with egg whites, and you have to fold it into the almond meal very gently so that it doesn't crack. This batter becomes ribbon-like and shiny, and once you get that consistency, you can begin to pipe it onto the silicone mat, so they're ready for baking. But in my first attempt to do this, I didn't realize how much the batter would spread out. and it became one sheet of a giant cracked cookie, and it was not very appealing. So I learned from this mistake once again and decided to spread them out a little bit, and they came out much better. Also, the filling inside was pretty simple, but there was a little bit of a learning curve figuring out how much to put in between the sandwich, but overall they turned out really great. So the other featured desserts of Phase 3 include the chocolate tart, lemon madeleines, and batons, or bread. And so the tart, which you all have as well, it was pretty simple, and it was a pretty simple recipe, but it taught me the differences between a tart from a pie. So I learned that the tart crust is much more like a cookie, while the pie crust is much more like a bread. And this is because the batter, or the crust, is a lot more moist when you bake it. The lemon madeleines are a French cake slash cookie, and I faced some challenges with these as well. While the actual batter was pretty simple to make, they were burnt very easily. And as you can see, some of the brown ones were put in the oven a little bit too long. And this is because you have to first put them in with a really high temperature on the oven. This allows them to puff up really high and create a really nice crust. But if you don't turn the oven temperature down fast enough, they burn, as you can tell. But I learned from this mistake, and while the second batch, the lighter colors, they didn't puff up as much and they didn't have as nice of a crust, they still were not overbaked. Lastly, I made these batons, which are like small baguettes. And it was a pretty simple bread recipe. I bet a lot of you have made bread before. And it all starts with poolish, which is actually a combination of yeast, flour, and water. And you let it sit for about a day before you start with the rest of the recipe. And you take this really sticky poolish and you add it to some more flour and begin to fold it and shape it and mold it. And this is the most important step of the process. And the special thing about the batons is the way that you shape them. You have to fold them a very specific way to get those really nice folds in the center. So overall, I did have a lot of challenges with this project. For example, time. Baking, as you know, takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of space. You have to go grocery shopping. I also had difficulty with the multitasking aspect of it. When you're making multiple desserts at one time and you have different components of each dessert, it can take a little getting used to all the moving parts to everything. And lastly, patience. So I could a little get frustrated by my perfectionism at times. And because, of course, as you've seen, none of them turned out to be perfect ever. And I don't think they'll ever be perfect. And I might have gotten frustrated about this at times, but I learned that it's just of the process. And that ties into basically what I learned about myself. I learned that accidents can be really good and sometimes turn out to the best desserts, and that's how I evolved and changed each recipe. And each product was definitely worth the frustration, and the reward was definitely worth the wait. So while I made all these things and they tasted really good, I wanted to learn more about how it related to science. So baking as a process can be thought of as a science. It can be thought of the scientific method. There are dependent variables that you change with each batch to get a different result. It's an experimental process. This also closely is an analogy for the central dogma theory of science. And this is a theory that says that all proteins are encoded by DNA. And I kind of thought of the DNA as the recipe for the protein. And the DNA is made of different nucleotides. And when these nucleotides are shifted, even the slightest, the protein can end up with a completely different structure and a completely different function. This is called a mutation. So with each recipe and dessert I made, it was like a different protein happening. Chemistry and temperature is also a crucial part to baking. Underbaking and overbaking, oven racks, and opening the oven a little bit too much, they all had a really crucial part in my experience. Also, not only did I learn how to bake, I also learned some crucial skills of cooking. For example, boiling the milk, sautéing, and this helps to denature and help blend all the ingredients together. Also, not only that, but the temperature of the ingredient themselves are crucial. For example, the butter with the scones, it had to be rock hard in order to get the right texture. When making the cannelés, you add eggs to boiled milk, but you don't want to add the eggs too fast or you'll end up with scrambled eggs in your vanilla cake, which nobody wants. So you have to make sure to add them really slowly because of the temperature of the different ingredients. And it also relates to biology in many different ways. As I said, temperature induces many physical and chemical changes. But you can't really understand baking without understanding the 4 macromolecules of biology. And these are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleotides. And all, of course, in baking, all the ingredients you use are organic materials, of course. And the way that these macromolecules interact determines how your product ends up. So for example, for the egg, sometimes you use only the egg white, while sometimes you only use the egg yolk, and I wanted to know why this happened. And this is because egg white has most of the protein, and it's sticky, and it's used in the choux pastry and the macaron to keep everything together without adding too much body. But the egg yolk, on the other hand, has a lot more fats and lipids, and it adds body and structure and melt things together. Another example of biology that I encountered was the yeast in the bread. And as you know, yeast is a living organism, and it eats the sugar and carbohydrates within the flour to produce carbon dioxide to help the bread rise. And it's very temperature sensitive, so when you add the warm water, it begins to activate, and it's a crucial part to making the bread. Of course, though, when you put the bread in the oven, the yeast cooks, and it is no longer alive, so we're all safe. So I've talked about science, and I've talked about my process, but you may be wondering, why does this matter to you? How can baking impact you? First of all, I noticed, and there are many studies to support me, that baking has a lot of psychological benefits. Baking improves brain function. Published in the Journal of Positive Psychology, 658 people were tracked for 2 weeks, and they baked a small thing, not an extravagant thing, just a small little task every single day. And they were recorded to be more enthusiastic about their next tasks each day. It also is very therapeutic, especially for people who have anxiety and depression. It's almost a form of mindfulness and meditation, focusing on repetitive acts while getting a reward. You can focus away from the busy world on your small tasks, and you can gain a sense of control over your ingredients, as well as a sense of accomplishment as you make beautiful things. It's also a way to connect with people around you and form a community with others as you share recipes and engage with each other. And it feels really good to give other people what you made and have a connection with those people too. Not only does it have psychological benefits, but there are also nutritional and environmental benefits to baking homemade stuff. So while these packaged desserts at supermarkets are cheap, convenient, and they're okay in moderation, they're very processed, and the chemicals within them aren't really good for you. These type of packaged desserts take the tradition and the comfort out of baking. These large processing plants and the distributors that these are made from have a huge carbon impact on the planet. And while desserts in general, yes, they're unhealthy, baking them yourself is a lot better for you. You can control exactly what is in each recipe and tweak them to your diets and preferences. You can support local businesses with your ingredients and encourage environmental change. So my next steps involve sharing this passion with the people around me to an even broader scale. As well as trying more recipes and trying more creative recipes, I'd also like to open it up to the Worcester Academy community. This could be through bake sales or tasting events, possibly even a baking club, to share these benefits with everybody around me. I'd also possibly like to make an Instagram or blog to get to share with people outside of the Worcester Academy community how baking has impacted me. So basically, overall, I just hope I could encourage you to start baking yourself. I hope I've given you a nice tasty treat, and thank you for listening. Okay, so any questions?
Which one is more difficult, baking or doing biology experiments?
Well, I guess it's not like what was more difficult, because I think the baking was the biology experiment, and it related a lot to the scientific process. So as I was baking, I didn't even really realize it as I was doing it, but I was doing experiments without me even knowing, and it was a really fun experiment, but it was kind of really closely tied in. So yeah.
What was this blowtorch you were talking about? That sounded
Well, with the peach pie, which you all also have, is so we sautéed the peaches, but then to get them to be really caramelized and have a really nice flavor, you can add some alcohol to them and then use a blowtorch to set them on fire. Obviously, the alcohol evaporates, but the peaches form a really nice and sugary crust around them that make them really delicious. Yes.
Well, I'm definitely a big fan. It's so delicious.
Thank you.
I really like how you immediately jump on the topics right away. You did a very good introduction and
Thank you.
all to to the points and with lots of pictures. That was very, very good.
Thank you.
Good job.
I also like the fact that you start baking, start introduce the steps, all the procedures, the learnings, and at the end you connect back to the science, your biology, and also environmental, and how you can help others. I really like that.
Thank you.
What was your most favorite?
My most favorite, I had a lot of favorites, but I think my favorites were the macarons and the chocolate hazelnut macarons, and we didn't make that much of them, so I ate them really quickly. That's why I don't have any. But I don't know, it was the most skill-oriented, I feel like, and I don't know, I think they're just really delicious, and they're really delicate and light, but I don't know, they're really good.
Which one gave you the greatest triumph?
Triumph. I'd say maybe one of them would be the 3-layered cake, because I felt really, really happy with how it ended up looking in the end, and I felt really happy with the pictures I took and how I arranged the blueberries. I don't know, I just felt it was like a really rewarding process to get to see the final pictures, and they were really beautiful and it tasted really good, so I think that would be the most rewarding one. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh.
Okay, so okay.
I can manually. Yeah. Which
Hello, everyone. My name is Krish Bahari, and my passion is exercising, and that is why I chose how exercise affects the brain. Okay, so you may ask why I chose this topic. First of all, I love to help people, but mainly, I love exercise. In fact, exercise changed my life. As in 5th grade, I played no sports. I had no friends because I couldn't talk to anyone about the big game yesterday. I decided that I wasn't going to live life like this. I was a kid and I had to be in the best shape of my life. So I decided to load up on sports 6th grade year. Looking back on it, I think this was one of the best decisions of my life. Not only did I get back into shape, I found my favorite hobby, running. I also made bonds with people I never would have made bonds with without exercise. I want others struggling with health to see what wonders exercise can do. Also, in 5th grade, I wasn't the best student. I had horrible grades. I was frustrated with myself, and so were my parents. But after I started to exercise in 6th grade, my grades skyrocketed up, and I wondered why. Looking back on the situation now, I think it was due to exercise and how it affected my brain. With that said, the objective of my project is to get more people outside and exercising. So, what is exercise? Exercise is defined as an activity that requires physical effort that helps the overall fitness. In total, there are 4 types of exercise: endurance, balance, flexibility, and strength. Each exercise has its own specific benefits, and smaller exercise within the major category of the exercise to emphasize or highlight a specific part of the body. When thinking of exercise, most people think of running, swimming, or biking. Well, these are all endurance or aerobic exercises. Endurance exercises are any exercises that increase the heart rate. Some benefits of endurance exercise is that it helps the heart, lungs, and circulatory system function correctly. Endurance exercises also reduce the chance of getting diabetes and heart disease. It is recommended by the American Heart Association that the average adult should get about 2.5 hours of moderate to intense endurance activity a week. It is suggested to make realistic goals that both push you and acknowledge your limits. If your limits are pushed too much, it may lead to injury. Endurance also helps the heart after a cardiac event. In fact, it is suggested by doctors that they should give heart attack patients a dose of cardio. Okay, reality check. Which exercise do you guys think is the most popular in the world? Either A, running, B, swimming, C, biking, or C, soccer. Those who guess correctly will get a mint as a reward. Okay, any suggestions?
Soccer.
A? A? Okay. Those who said A, please come up and get your reward. You're welcome. Okay. When thinking of exercise, balance training doesn't necessarily come to mind. However, good balance is required to keep your muscles and cores strong. Balance exercises are exercises that increase the overall balance. Examples of such exercises include yoga and tai chi. Benefits of balance exercise include stronger and more stable legs, glutes, and core. Also, they strengthen your painful joints, therefore leading to prevention of back pain. Flexibility training is essential for exercise. Flexibility stretches the body, therefore leading to a wider range of motion. The goal of all flexibility exercises is to increase the range of motion while also keeping joint stability. Benefits of flexibility training is reduced back pain and less chance of injury due to a wider range of motion. Flexibility training is thought to be the bridge between the mind, body, and spirit through yoga techniques. Examples of flexibility training and exercises include yoga and stretching. Strength training is the use of weights to increase overall muscle fitness through training a certain muscle or muscle group against external resistance. Common machines used during strength training include free weights, weight machines, and body weight. The fundamental concept of weight training is to overwhelm the muscles so much that they are depleted and forced to regrow back stronger. The obvious benefit of strength training is that it leads to stronger muscles. However, strength training also protects bone health and muscle mass. Cardio and diet aren't the only ways to lose weight. It's proven that strength training increases resting metabolism, or the rate in which the body burns calories at a complete rest. What many people do not know are the mind benefits of exercise. Some mind benefits of exercise include more energy throughout the day, better sleep at night, and a boost to one's individual ego. It is also proven that exercise helps mild depression. Exercise increases one's feelings of calm and well-being. Exercise also releases these chemicals called endorphins in the brain that boosts one's ego and energy levels. And lastly, exercise is a good distraction from all the negativity in one's life. There are obviously many physical benefits to exercise. Some physical benefits include improved blood pressure, lower chances of heart disease due to the constant flow of oxygen, and a gain in overall muscle mass. Okay, moving on to the brain. The brain is a 3-pound organ that controls functions, and memorizes material. How does the brain receive information? Well, through the 5 senses: sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing. The brain is split in half and connected by these fibers, called the corpus callosum. These fibers deliver messages from one side of the brain to another. Moving on to the 3 major parts of the brain: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It's so big that it has 2 hemispheres. The cerebellum is located under the cerebrum, and the brainstem is located under the cerebellum, and it's thought to be the bridge between the cerebrum and the spinal cord. Each part of the brain has its own respective functions. The function of the cerebrum is to perform higher tasks, such as touch, vision, hearing, speech, learning, and reasoning. The cerebellum is more to do with good posture and coordination of muscle movements. And finally, the brainstem controls all non-voluntary movements, such as digestion, sleep cycles, and sneezing. To summarize the brain serves as a control center for the entire body and mind. The primary benefit of exercise on the brain is that exercise pumps oxygen into the brain, therefore leading to a healthier brain. Exercise also aids the bodily release of hormones, therefore leading to the ideal environment for brain cell growth. So you may ask, what are the best exercises for the brain? Well, any exercises that increase your heart rate. Examples of such include running and swimming. So next time you guys have free time, I suggest you go outside. After all, it helps your brain. Okay, the main problem I faced during my project is the lack of reliable resources. I struggled to find resources that were reliable in my case. To get around this, I kind of dug deeper, found some really nice associations. For example, the American Heart Association. Yeah, thanks. Any questions? Yes.
You said the exercise actually brings more oxygen to the brain, but like, so my Total understanding, I thought when you exercise that oxygen goes to your body, to your muscles.
The oxygen? Okay, that's a very good question. The oxygen goes all around your body, and it ultimately goes to the brain, and therefore, like the brain experiences the benefits. Yes?
You talked about going outside to exercise. Is it better to exercise outside? Are there more benefits than exercising indoors?
Outside, it's proven that it relieves your body more because of the natural like sounds and environment, but it's totally fine to go inside. You'll experience some of the same benefits. Yes.
So I heard exercise can also produce some of the chemicals like for people like who addict, like if you continue to exercise for a certain amount of time, like then you probably get addicted. You don't exercise, you kind of feel bad. Is that true?
I haven't heard about this, but I definitely know what you're talking about. I've seen some like big gym addicts, and I think there is some kind of chemical that releases during exercise that kind of makes it more addicting. Other questions? Nope. Okay. Thank you. Probably not. Yeah, probably. Do you need this? Do you need this? I don't know. Put that in your pocket. Or in your Just right here's fine.
Isn't that close?
That's fine.
Where's Dr. Crothers? Because, wait, do we know if it's recording or not? Like, what is this? Can we get him?
No, it's fine. Is that good? Try.
I'm Jacob.
And I'm Edward.
And our 20% project is on procrastination. So we chose this project because we both struggle with procrastination a lot, and we decided that'd be a good idea to research why it happens and how we can stop it so that we can become better students. So our first question was, why do we procrastinate? We figured out that procrastination has quite a few different reasons to why it happens. Some of those reasons being stress, anxiety, a lack of confidence, a feeling of needing to feel instant gratification, and the fear of missing out.
Okay, so what is instant gratification? And that's a very good question, but to answer it first, we need to know what gratification is. And so gratification is the feeling when you satisfy a desire or when you complete something, and that's a good feeling, and it's a good thing to feel. However, instant gratification is not a good thing. It's wanting to feel that same desire of completing something and having that good energy, but without having to do anything at all. And this can be through playing a video game or putting off a hard task to do something a lot easier to feel that instant gratification, even though you should be working on something else. And so, legendary blog writer Tim Urban, in his blog Wait But Why, wanted to study procrastination, and he produced these diagrams of the brain to make it easier for us to understand what goes on in a procrastinator's mind versus a non-procrastinator's mind. So first we have the non-procrastinator's brain, and inside of it, at the wheel, is a rational decision maker. And the rational decision maker does things that make sense. He thinks in the long term, makes plans ahead for what will be best. He's not a child, as he says. But in the procrastinator's brain, you still have that rational decision maker, but he had his friend right here, the instant gratification monkey. And the rational decision maker is the same as the one in the original drawing of the non-procrastinator, but he has to deal with the instant gratification monkey constantly nagging at his feet. And so you might be wondering, so what does the instant gratification monkey do? So our rational decision maker will make the rational decision and think, this is a perfect time to get some stuff done. But that instant gratification monkey is not a fan of that plan. So it's like, nope. And then so that monkey will take control of the wheel and decide, you know what, we're going to do whatever I want to do because that's a lot more fun. And then at the very last minute, we can start to do the work that we were supposed to be doing in the first place. And obviously this is terrible. So me and Jacob always wondered what causes procrastination. However, there are a lot of hidden causes for procrastination. And some of these that you don't even realize might be your window shades and what type of clock you use. Now, most people keep their window shades down because they don't want to see the outside world. They don't want the outside world seeing what they're doing. It's a sense of privacy. But what's really going on is with your window shades down, you can't see the sun moving across the sky. You can't see when the sun sets or when the sun rises. And that messes up your brain's internal clock. And humans are a very visual species. We use our eyes for most of our functions. So without being able to tell when the sun rises or sets, it messes up with our human's internal clock. And so there was a study of the brain done by many different scientists working at Harvard, and they discovered that when a human was put in a room where their sense of light and their internal clock would be completely messed up, was put, those humans, every 8 hours or so, their sense of what time it was would become worse by 2 times progressively. And with analog and digital clocks, you might be wondering, what's the difference? And the answer is that the analog clock is actually much, much better for you to try to figure out what time it is than the digital clock is. Because the digital clock displays in numbers, while the analog clock works more in fractions. And so looking at an analog clock, you might think right now, it's 10:10. And the digital clock might tell you the same thing, but even more accurate. The digital clock can tell you it down to the second, and you might think, yeah, so the digital clock is obviously better. But that's not how it works, because humans have a very good sense of progression. On an analog clock, you can see the hour progressing very clearly. You can see that when it's 10:30, you can see, oh, half of the hour is gone because the minute hand is now facing straight down. While on the digital clock, it'll just say 30, and your brain doesn't comprehend that as well. You can think of it as an analogy as looking at a pie. When you see a pie that's 50% eaten, you'll see half of that pie. But let's say we took that pie into another room, and instead we just had a digital number that just said 50. You wouldn't know as much and wouldn't be able to think as much about how much that pie is left.
So what part of the brain is actually responsible for procrastination? Well, you see, there are two aspects of the brain that involve procrastination. One is the amygdala, which controls emotion and motivation. Now, the amygdala often is the cause for procrastination, making it so that you want to procrastinate more, while the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex is the part of the brain which prevents procrastination. Oftentimes, procrastination occurs when your amygdala is either a little larger than the corsal anterior cingulate cortex in the proportions that it should be, or the connection between those two parts of the brain is weak, making it so that the cortex isn't able to prevent the amygdala from procrastinating more. Also, when you procrastinate, the amygdala grows slightly larger each time, and this cycle makes it so that you procrastinate more and more, and at a faster and faster rate.
Okay, so everyone might procrastinate on something because no one is perfect. But me and Jacob have some common methods of procrastination, and we did a study of many students to see what their common methods of procrastination were. And we come up with these big 5 results the most. And what these all share is they're very good at manipulating the human's brain sense of fear of missing out, or FOMO. And so, what is the fear of missing out? So we've all had that time when we missed out on an experience and it felt really bad because you weren't there and everyone else wasn't. They're all telling you about it. But in reality, what we think we're missing out, or what we suffer from our imagination, is usually not the case of what really happens. And what really happens generally isn't all that bad. And so your fear of missing out is often on a scale from low to high. And it can fall anywhere on that scale. And so, in reality, you might think that the app is bothering you, but by deleting the app, you're not really solving your problem. By deleting Instagram, you might think, I've saved myself from a world of suffering. But in reality, what that's actually doing is causing your fear of missing out to develop more and more, and you start to think more like, oh shoot, what am I missing out right now? I think something interesting is happening. And you start to become paranoid. And so the fear of missing out, or FOMO, works in a factory way. And then, so let's say you wake up in the morning, you open up the app, we'll say Twitter, you see a tweet, then you close the app and you continue with your day. However, it's really not that simple. What we really do is we open up the app, we see a tweet, we close the app, and then we try to continue with our day. But our brain starts to think about that information. And then it gets curious. It wants to know more. So it goes back and opens up the app to satisfy that need. But as you close that app again, you might see something else, which will make your brain curious. It'll want to know more, so you open up the app. And this cycle continues and continues until you've wasted a long period of time.
Now, some of our struggles for making this presentation was related to our procrastination. See, a long-term project is one of the easiest things to procrastinate on, as it's harder to set deadlines for yourself, and there's more time to spend procrastinating. Often, we'd find ourselves working on our project for a few days, but not being able to consistently work on it at a pace that would benefit our ability to create a proper presentation. So there'd be spaces between our working, which would be consistent working and then not working at all, and then having to work harder later along the line of closer to the due date.
And the funny thing about working on a project, trying to research procrastination and prevent it, is as procrastinators, we tend to procrastinate on working on this project, which is kind of defeating the purpose, but eventually we overcame that and were able to get this done.
Now, a common pattern, actually, between a lot of procrastinators is the fact that a long-term assignment can have a higher chance of being procrastinated on than a shorter-term assignment. And as I mentioned earlier, this is because of this long-term project having so much time. You are able to you have so much time available to procrastinate on it that you don't think to yourself how important it is to spend that time working on the project as you may like a short-term assignment that's assigned one day and due the very next day.
So our next steps. Me and Jacob learned a lot from this project, and we plan to use what we learned to better improve our learning. So by beating our procrastination habits, we can probably become better students. And by becoming better students, we can also improve other aspects of our life through what we learned.
So how can we prevent procrastination? Well, the disappointing truth is you can never truly prevent procrastination. However, you can suppress it. And there are a few methods that we came up with to suppress procrastination. One of them was creating a physical agenda. Having a physical agenda and being able to cross out assignments that you write down, it gives you a higher feeling of gratitude and makes both your amygdala and your cortex feel better about certain assignments or objectives that you've created for yourself.
Now, at my old middle school in Shrewsbury, when students were struggling, there would be a group of teachers that would help them. And one of the things each student was given was a physical planner that they were required to write all their assignments and their plans on. And by doing this, the students were better able to plan their days, and what they found was a 5 to 6% grade boost in what they learned. Other ways we can suppress procrastination is by changing our clocks. I started wearing an analog watch rather than a digital watch because it works much better towards making my brain think about the time and makes me a better planner.
Also, I started working occasionally in places that had more access to natural light, like the window shade example from before. On days that I worked upstairs, outside of areas like my basement, which didn't really have many windows, I realized that I'd be more productive and I'd be able to see the day and night cycle, which Edward talked about earlier, that helped my brain think about when an assignment was started and when an assignment was finished so that I could work faster and work more productively.
Another thing that really helps and what we found out is meditation. And there were many studies, but one study that was by the Ruhr University discovered that through meditation, you could shrink the part of the brain in called your amygdala, which would cause you to procrastinate. It would actually help you develop the other part of your brain, or known as the DAC, or the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex.
So you may be wondering how our presentation can help you. Obviously, if you struggle with procrastination, you can apply any of our conclusive results to your daily life to see if it helps you when you try to procrastinate.
Do you think parents reminding you how to suppress procrastination or making things worse?
It really depends on the person. So like certain people, they'll get annoyed by it and then they'll decide, you know what, I'm not going to do that just because you told me. But for other people, they might think, oh, that's a great idea, maybe I should do that.
How about you?
I personally think that reminding, if you're a parent, reminding your child, work in a place that has more natural light, or something that's more simple, like using an analog clock, at least while you're doing your homework, will probably be more helpful. But if you were very strict about it, or if you were more invasive about your student's work, I think that it would cause more stress for your student. And if the student experiences stress as a reason for the procrastination, I don't think it would help.
Have you looked into how much is genetic, and how much is environmental cause of procrastination?
Oh yes, genetics do play a big part because genetics decide maybe how tall we are, but in the brain it will decide how large our amygdala is, and the larger your amygdala is, the more influence it has over the brain. So genetically, certain people will be more inclined to procrastinate than others, but it can also be trained through meditation because you can start to shrink that amygdala down to a more manageable size, and then you can get more stuff done.
I have a question of the parenting. So, do you think more strict and like more enforced parents, maybe like telling their child like very strict rules, maybe like kind of change their values and kind of value more like freedom and stuff like that rather than like getting homework done and then like whatever they want.
If it causes you stress and anxiety and you feel like you need to like have freedom and you prefer freedom, then your instant gratification would probably be more geared towards getting freedom. So instead of you're doing your homework first, you might want to just do what you want to do first, because like that's the gratification. That's what you receive the most gratification from.
So I've got a couple of questions. It sounds a lot like this is an addiction. Have there been any addiction therapies that would try and either suppress or combat procrastination?
The thing with procrastination that like makes it like so hard to beat is it's like very different for every single person. Like with like diseases, like there's always a common pattern because it's the same thing, but every human's like mental structure is different, and so the way that each human decides I'm gonna procrastinate can be different. Like some people decide I'm gonna procrastinate to a week before the assignment is due for a month-long project, while others decide that I'm gonna do it the day before because I think I can handle that, while others decide I'm just not gonna procrastinate and do it the way it was designed.
Well, I think there is some scientific evidence out there suggesting that the same areas of the brain that is stimulated during addiction is also stimulated during Twitter, Instagram use, and that can end up influencing procrastination. Is there a correlation there?
Yeah, that ties back to like the idea of gratification, where like if you like complete a big homework task or a big task and you get to like turn it in, you'll feel like a sense of gratification, like wow, I really just did this. This is a very big thing that I spent forever on and now it's done. But with like Instagram, it's easy just to like see something and go, wow, that's pretty cool, and then earn yourself some instant gratification, which isn't good.
So how can you end up turning that around and addressing procrastination, say for school or other areas in your life? Let me rephrase that. How did you end up turning this around? And you mentioned earlier that you used some techniques to get this project done, right? What were some of those techniques that you researched that you could use in other areas, say in academics or in other areas of your life, that helped you get this project done?
Oh, so you're saying like the physical agenda and like the sort of the different clocks and the shades and stuff like that. I think like if you put those into effect, like say at a school, like if you had a lot of windows maybe, or if a school like only had analog clocks, something like that may help like during class. If that's not what you're asking, then
So you're saying
I'm
I
not
should
sure.
fix my clock.
So, I mean,
Well, no, I'm serious
well,
with that.
your clock.
It's a 15-minute delay, so we can do a little bit of math there and like figure it out. But
I think it could help if people are working like in class on an assignment, but if it was something like trying to pay attention to like note taking or someone who's presenting, the clock, if you just didn't have the clock, it would probably be helpful for like people that were anticipating like, oh, I want to know when the end of class is, because their attention might be diverted to the clock. So I think it depends on what the situation in the classroom is.
also like for the freshman class, at least for us, so we have like meditation and health class, and that really helps to like let your mind rest, because in our modernized world, we really don't give our brains a chance to like really just sit down and like do nothing and not have to worry for a few minutes.
So you actually the one slide you showed you did a survey, right? Showed like many of the social media cause some procrastination, right? Do you think by putting your electronics away, shut down the social media while you're working, would that help?
Well, that like ties into the fear of missing out, because then you start to have that kick in, and you think I'm probably missing out on something important. I bet something really big is happening, and I'm going to be the only one that doesn't know. When in reality, that's not really happening.
Yeah, but you can do it at the end of the day, right? Give yourself a half hour to check you don't miss out.
So I do have a suggestion. I think a lot of the problem today is making worse by technology, right? But people invent technology. Maybe you guys in a few years invent some technology become an antidote of this problem, right? I don't know what it is, but you guys are pretty smart. Maybe think of some technology actually kind of acting like a detox of addiction, but people still feel connected, not feeling like you're putting yourself in a box.
Isn't there a app that you can put on your phone that will give you a certain amount of time to check Instagram or Snapchat, and then it will cut off? Oh, I'm sorry. I probably shouldn't have said that.
There is an app.
Yeah, I mean, no.
But in their own studies, they discovered that like, can't remember the exact percentage, but like more than 30% of the users would go into the app and then try to manually disable it so that they wouldn't have to deal with that, and they can just forget about that app entirely. So it would become like less and less productive.
It sounds from what you're saying to me like the instant gratification part with these devices is so stimulated that it overrides. Is that what it is?
Like the instant gratification overrides the rational decision making.
Yeah.
And
so how could it be beneficial to combating procrastination to have the actual thing that's stimulating that there to get more of the same? I really don't.
Well, it's really hard for people who like procrastinate to sort of separate like, you know, like times for like, oh, this is time for me to like, look at social media, and then it's time for me to do my homework. Some people will use methods like, you know, giving themselves time at the beginning of like when they get home or something, and they'll like look at social media, and then they'll give themselves like separate sections of time after the school day is over to like do homework.
Well, there's some people that can have one glass of wine or two and they're fine, and others that can't stop. They can't
So.
stop. They can't. No, I'm serious.
Yeah,
There are
but
some people who cannot function with and around something like, say, alcohol or heroin or whatever it would be. And other people can have like one or two pieces of cake. Other people, that's not one piece of cake for me. That's the whole cake, and I can't stop. You know, it's a serious problem for some people. So for those who can't stop, having the thing nearby, you know, I guess like what you said, everybody's different.
yeah, like it's a lot about like self-discipline too. So I'm gonna use that cake example. Like, so like Facebook is really good at like taking your data and then using it to highly specialize what you see, so that you spend more time on their app, so they can make more money. And then that's like having a baker that like sees you eating his cake, and then he goes, oh, asks you like, what do you like, without you really knowing it, and then specializing that cake even more, so that you just can't stop eating that cake until.
It sounds like a drug pusher, just
Pretty much.
having a little bit more every single time.
Yeah, so it's like self-discipline, and it's like steadily working your way down more than just like jumping it immediately from like going from like 0 to 100 and then 100 back to 0.
But is it self-discipline? I mean, if the limbic system and the reward system is overriding your rational judgment, does self-discipline come into that?
Well, training things like your amygdala through meditation is partly self-discipline, because you have to, I guess, something that you choose to do. And I think, like, I guess I'm not 100% sure, like, of like if this corresponds to your point, but like being able to sort of make yourself do certain things that'll prevent you from procrastinating as often is like sort of self-discipline, I think. And so like you can work on like your procrastination even if it's like even if it might seem impossible at first.
So small baby steps.
Yeah,
In the right direction.
I think.
So then, as a teacher, what could I do, say next year, to help my students take those small baby steps?
So a lot of the time with procrastinators, just like how the agenda has specific boxes for like each part of your day and each day of the week, I think for a lot of large assignments that are easy to procrastinate on, having multiple smaller deadlines inside of those assignment like lifespans can probably help people who struggle with procrastination to meet those goals, at least make a certain amount of progress for each span of time so that they aren't procrastinating as heavily.
And like with your field experiences, those are really good at like training you to meditate outside and like let go. And that's what like meditation is all about. And it's like it's shown that meditation really does help you like, relieve this problem.
So then how would you incorporate meditation?
Just like we build in like blocks of the day where we like decide it's time to eat dinner. We like you have to have that kind of block of your day where you decide right now I should be meditating for I don't know 5-10 minutes just to like let my brain really rest.
I'm gonna put both of you on the spot. I'm gonna do this at home and actually try this.
We're hoping that we'll be able to try all of our fully try all of our conclusions like for the next school year when we are able to like start for the new sort of a new slate and have all of these laid out for us to use and like help us grow and prevent our procrastination.
Why wait for this next school year? Well, no, but if you use the summer, take 5 minutes, 6 minutes, and you start begin to train yourself and not have academics over your head, but then focusing on meditation, trying to train your amygdala and other parts of the limbic system step by step. Summer is the great way to do that.
I agree. I think I didn't really think of that, but it's definitely something that I should try over the summer. If I got into the habit of it, it would probably be easier to incorporate next school year.
Edward?
Yeah, working with something that I was trying to think of was New Year's resolutions. A lot of New Year's resolutions fail because they're like you just immediately take that big step at the start of the new year instead of like steadily working up until you can finally like do what you accomplished. Because no one really just like climbs the mountain up in one step. You have to take all the tiny steps to make it to the top.
So if you could just take the next 1 or 2 minutes and fill out the feedback form, I would appreciate that.
That was pretty good.
Thank you.